Hello, this is Space Captain Mark Williamson for the Biostatistics Core of the DaCCoTA project at the University of North Dakota. This is BERD Core Special Topics Talk number 11, Frontiers in Statistics. Buckle up, double check your gauges, and blast off. So, what we're going to be doing here today is exploring the frontiers of statistical methods and techniques. Now, this is going to be a rather informal talk, as it is hard to get a definitive answer on the frontier, where definitive guides and resources are few and far between. And also remember, statistics is typically application-based, so you can't really talk about problems or frontiers in the abstract. It has to be on specific applications, of which there are myriad directions that we can't all cover at once. So what we'll be doing here to try to tackle this problem in some form is to first go over some of the current state-of-the-art procedures that I perceive are ongoing, then stare down some looming problems in statistics and computing in general, describe a framework of potential solutions or next steps to take, and then equip ourselves with some resources before finally striking out towards new statistical worlds and new statistical vistas through scientific paper examples, showing just what's being done right now to advance frontier. Well, what are you waiting for? Let's blast off. So, let us examine the stars above for our current status of some statistical methods. I've grouped them into four kind of main ones and then some others. So the four main ones I see as sort of the state of the art is generalized linear mixed models, Bayesian methods, simulation, and machine learning. These are not independent of each other, there are interactions, but schematically I'm going to separate them. Then finally our other, which I'm going to branch out not into so much topics but specific resources that cover frontiers. So high dimensional data, data scientist methods, cutting edge in life sciences techniques, and then a paper that is referenced in a book called Frontiers of Statistics, where I got the title. Let's dig into each of these topics in detail. First, we have generalized linear mixed models, which I had the great privilege of learning a lot about as an undergraduate and early graduate student. It's really a switching of the paradigm from sort of the ordinary least squares methods, which undergirds a lot of classic statistical tests like ANOVA and regression, to a maximum likelihood. And the ordinary least squares has been around for a while, one, because it can be done by hand, whereas maximum likelihood really needs modern computers, but is a more generalized method. So what goes into a generalized linear mixed model? Well, first of all, there's a generalized part. It really lets us go beyond the Gaussian distribution or the normal distribution. Data no longer has to be assumed to be normal or wrangled to fit into it, or then just use a weaker non-parametric test. We can use other distributions like the Poisson, beta, logistic, negative binomial, the list goes on. So we can much better model our data with distributions that fit that data's generation properties. Then there's the mixed part of our models. This is the mixed mean including fixed and random effects. So you can have fixed effects, things that you care about, that all sort of categories are set up in there, and random, where it's more along the lines of trying to account for variation or error, and where only a subset of all possible categories are present. And really, the nice thing about generalized linear models is really there's, for most statistical procedures, or at least standard ones, it's really, the model lets you have everything in one place. In fact, one of my most popular videos on this channel has been on generalized linear mixed models for everything. So if you want to go check that out, that will give you more of a taste of what I mean there. Next, let's turn to Bayesian methods. So Bayesian, unlike frequentist methods, does not depend on sample size, which is really helpful, and it's always open to new data because you have the prior data, the posterior, etc., etc. And for a while there, Bayesian methods couldn't be fully utilized because you couldn't really do posterior simulation without computing. But now with modern computing, especially with Monte Carlo or Markov chains, you can do that. So that has really grown the ability to do Bayesian methods. And there's really, lots of activity on Bayesian modeling. In fact, I do have a set of 3 Bayesian analysis modules if you want to dig more into that. I'm constantly trying to learn more about Bayesian because that's definitely on the cutting edge here. And the nice thing is, for every real frequencies method, there's usually a Bayesian equivalent, so you don't have to sort of totally drop how you might have known how to do statistics. I certainly haven't switched over completely, but I've been trying to incorporate more Bayesian methods into my work. All right, turning over to simulation, which has to do a lot with Bayesian methods because a big part of that, of course, as I said, is that posterior simulation. So these are not completely separate. Anyways, simulation, really because of modern computing, you can do a lot of powerful uses in simulation. Some of the things you can do, shown by this reference, you can generate confidence intervals by bootstrapping, use Monte Carlo to investigate the performance of statistical procedures, and generate estimate posterior distribution. So feeds a lot into what is done in Bayes. More simply, and what I like to use it for a lot, is you can create mock data with known characteristics to really be able to model, try things out, make sure you're doing your statistics correctly or trying to learn properly. And then also, it is a core component of our resampling methods. Okay, finally, on this slide, we'll talk about machine learning. And so machine learning, it's definitely a big buzzword. What it is, sort of on a high level, which is really what I need because I still don't understand it terribly. But anyways, it is a branch of AI focusing on the use of data and algorithms to improve with more data. So you feed it more data, for lack of a better word, the machines learn from that data to get better at predicting later on. And it's notably used in methods like classification, predictors, and data mining. And again, there's lots of activity, and I really hope to soon have a future special topics talk on this. So after I've learned more about it and be able to distill it down and present it in a somewhat coherent manner. Okay, so with the more monolithic topics taken care of, let's look at more the collections of topics going on here. First, we have high dimensional data. So that happens when there's many more variables than observations, which is typically a no-no in standard regression. You want to have a lot more observations, so you want to have many more rows than variables, or think of columns. But this is starting to pop up more and more. Some strong examples are like healthcare data, financial data, or like genomics. We have all sorts of variables, but not nearly as many observations. So you need to use specific methods to really deal with these. And there are ones coming out and really on the cutting edge here, like ridge, lasso, and principal components regression. And there's other ones there, but those are some of the most glaring examples. Additionally, I thought a good snapshot of kind of the current status of things, current cutting edge, is this picture of statistical techniques data scientists should master. Now, see, this is data scientists, which is a little bit different from more like biologists, epidemiologists, more science researchers, but I think this also fits. And we can see here a lot of the things we've already talked about. Like, for example, we saw ridge regression here. We have other dimensional reduction for high dimensional data. Support vector machines, I think it's branch of the machine learning. Things like nonlinear models, that's a big thing. Unsupervised learning, that falls into machine learning. Some of the tree-based methods as well, or at least into simulation. Same with resampling, that's under simulation. Linear regression, classification, etc. So I like this table. It's really helpful, and you can find references to it here if you want to post it up. I actually have it up on my wall here just so I can look at it and be reminded of, like, okay, this is the scope of what some people need to learn and do in modern statistics. Okay, switching over, we have this paper called Cutting Edge Statistical Methods for a Life Course Approach. So I really find that this was helpful to showcase just what's being done on the cutting edge for life course approach. So regression or covariates, that's sort of standard, but then things like hazard modeling, individual growth modeling, structural equation modeling, so there's some of this multivariate stuff, and then propensity score analysis, and then degression discontinuity analysis. So these are some of the things that are kind of specific applications that, depending on the data you need, can really be helpful. And then finally, I'm going to look at frontiers of statistics. So these are in a book. I'll also give you references to like essentially the table of contents. This is where I kind of pulled out the major points here. But there's a book. I really hope to buy it. Eventually, at this point, I don't have access to it. But these, I think this was in like 2009, so it's a little bit dated. But I think it gives a good snapshot of like what sort of is being developed on the frontiers. So we have semi-parametric modeling, non-parametric modeling. So you see sort of generalized models, statistical learning and bootstrapping. So again, bootstrapping goes into like resampling methods, longitudinal data analysis. So dealing with things with time, statistics inside technology applications, financial. So again, applications, and then parametric techniques and inferences. So I think more abstract or generalized. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful sort of sweep of the landscape. Now let's get into some serious looming problems in statistics. So we have overly simple or outdated models, large data sets, replication significance, and computational limits. And again, this is what I see and understand as looming problems. This is not a definitive list, so take it with a grain of asteroid salt. Okay, digging more into these problems. First of all, overly simple and outdated models. So I find that a lot of scientific research is very basic statistics are still being used where better modeling will be helpful, like using ANOVA rather than a generalized linear model and so forth. And another big thing I learned with generalized linear models is as well, like things with regression, ANOVA, and things with models that have assumptions of normality or Gaussian distribution. The reality is like nothing is really, or almost nothing is really normally distributed. So dealing with these sort of outdated models, overly simplistic models, can really stymie quality scientific research. And another thing, we're getting more complicated data with lots of noise or a small signal, which makes it hard to find a true effect. And so you really need to have careful pausing, you really have careful methods to be able to pull out what's really going on here despite all the fuzz. Another thing I find with this topic is, especially in teaching researchers or teaching students about statistics, there's a problem with trying to link the three parts of statistical analysis together. Your important research question, like how many ducks are in a pond, it's usually very concrete, very specifically based on the researcher's interest. But then you also have the statistical model, the mathematics that go into trying to answer a question, like is this group of ducks significantly different from that other group of ducks? And that takes understanding of that model. But then there's also the computer coding that goes into getting a computer to run the model on the data and spit it out. And so there's a problem with like linking these three together, not like a technical or computational problem, but more of a teaching problem to really help researchers go from their concrete research questions to the abstract statistical model to the also abstract computer coding, typing it in to have the computer spit out a reasonable output, because computers are fast but dumb. So if you don't understand what goes in and out of it, it's not going to tell you. It's just going to do what it tells you, even if you tell it something wrong. So that is definitely a problem of being able to more clearly and cogently explain what computers are doing with statistical models to put out research questions. And that's part of why I try to do some of these statistical special topics, statistical teaching to improve that literacy. Okay, another big problem here is large data sets. We've kind of already gone over some of that with the high dimensional, but these are high dimensional and have large sample size. So they really definitely require a computer. One problem that comes with such large data sets is when you're dealing with like multiple comparisons, it's very easy to have spurious correlations, and you can run into problems with like data mining or things like that, or p-hacking, where you really have to step lightly when you have so much data that you could have significant interactions just by chance. And another issues with large data sets is the large data sets aren't usually just generated by one thing. It's often multiple aggregations of data put together and combined, and so they're often very heterogeneous and come from different experimental designs. It might be very messy, so a lot of care needs to go into making sure the data is quality controlled, cleaned up, interpreted correctly, and accurate. And finally, I also find an issue with large data, especially on like the genomics, metagenomics end, so that biological spectrum, that it seems like that's often hard to have coherent stories and results coming from such data. Like, I call this the metagenomics problem. It's like, well, we got all this metagenomic data from all these species, and then really all we can do with it so far is just kind of give broad summaries of what we found, and there's so much sort of data and like interesting questions that don't seem to come out of it other than a broad summary that doesn't really tell us anything other than, again, just a broad summary. So there seems to be a need to use for imagination, probably new tools to really make metagenomic output into coherent narratives that tell us real things and useful things, exciting things about the world. Okay, continue on here. We have replication and significance. So one big thing is, of course, you may have already heard in other contexts, the idea of the replication crisis, where you have a lot of these high-profile scientific studies, especially like more in like, I think, psychology field, it's especially problematic, where these high-end scientific studies are unable to be replicated. So what we think they're telling us apparently is not nearly as strong as what it first seemed, and so that's not an easy problem to unravel. Also, again, with large data sets, more messy, complex things going on, we start to have larger random areas, so we can't. The low-hanging fruit of large, easily seen effects is shrinking, where we're starting to have much more messier signal that needs to be pulled out using sophisticated methods. Another thing with replicated significance is, I think a lot of times studies can be underpowered, because as we're trying to do more and more and explore more and more, we have less things to work with, especially in, I think, the biomedical models, where there might be a lot of time and effort put into creating mouse models, but only a few mice are actually used, and so you're unable to find a real effect. And so that can kind of be a looming problem, especially when bigger and bigger studies are sort of put together to answer broad questions. And then finally, just in general, the problems with p-values. This has gone along for a while. There's a 1999 paper, which is essentially like this. I think it's called the statistical insignificance of significance testing, where the standard thing of doing a p-value to show significance really has problems, and that can be partially upset by more sophisticated models. And in fact, some programs like in R, like the package LME4 doesn't even create p-values. And then similarly in Bayesian statistics, it doesn't use p-values. It uses confidence intervals or the equivalent confidence intervals. So there are methods of getting around this, but as long as we're still using methods that report p-values, we need to really be careful with what they're telling us and how much confidence they're actually giving. Anyways, moving on to our final thing here is finally computational limits. So again, large complex data sets are becoming common. That's a running theme here. And one thing to note is even with powerful computing, some problems take too long for a brute solution. That is, trying every possible combination to find the best one. Like phylogenetic trees, for example. After a certain size of trees, it would essentially take longer than the age of the universe to actually run. So you have to take shortcuts to look at a subset of the trees to find the best one. So it's good. While computers are amazing and fast and can do a lot of things, they can't do everything. There are some problems where it doesn't matter how fast you do it, it's simply too big. So you can't look at everything. You have to intelligently pick out subsets of things to look at to get hopefully close to the best answer without knowing for sure if you have the best answer. And then there's other models, even without the brute solution. Other models just take a lot of time to train. Seems like AI models often take a lot of time to train, a lot of data to train. And another thing, just on a sort of practical economic level, hardware supplies of things that go into computers and supercomputers, they're also limited. So we can't just have an infinite amount of superpowered computers. We have to work with what we've got. So one thing that might be changing here is instead of, it used to be, especially with the growth of computers, is you just throw more computing power at a problem, bigger, better, longer, to sort of solve things, but kind of reaching the limit of our actual computer power and the hardware we have for it, there's likely going to be much more of a shift from computer power to algorithmic innovation, so making our programs more clever and intuitive, and whatever words you want to throw there, working smarter, not harder, as it were. Okay, with those looming problems, let's look at some potential solutions. These aren't like point by point, here's a solution to every problem I looked at here. It's more like a general framework for how do we solve problems or advance the field forward. So the three I'm going to kind of look at here is, first is just changing our framework. The second is having better models. And then the third, most exotic, more alien and unknown of them, is new models. So first, we can change our framework. One way to do that is to look at something like Bayes instead of frequencies, which is already, of course, being done. And the real big shift between Bayes and frequencies method is, well, in Bayes, a probability is a degree of belief to an event that takes in past and present knowledge. So it gives better understanding of what we don't know of our uncertainty. So it's more realistic in many ways. And in that, parameters are random where data is fixed, as opposed to frequencies where parameters are fixed and data is random. And then the other thing I put down here is Mandelbrot. Now, this is sort of out there. I don't really see evidence of like Mandelbrottian statistics other than like a name of a Mandelbrot distribution. I don't see evidence of this being used, but I recently read this book called here's an example of Bayes and then Mandelbrot and Fractal. But I read this book called The Black Swan, which kind of talked about the problems of like the normal distribution and that sort of thing, and how we need to deal more in the realms of uncertainty with sort of a Mandelbrot framework. So I thought, well, this is definitely a frontier way out there, but maybe considering more of the approach of Mandelbrot to statistics will be useful. So here's a link to the Black Swan book if you want to take a look at it. Again, it's sort of out there and just sort of my musings, as it were. All right, let's turn to some other potential solutions. First is better models. So first, we can simplify. That is, don't make a model overly complex one we don't understand. And I find actually generalized linear mixed models to often be helpful for this, because they're like all in one place instead of having to do more complicated models or like multiple models or like do different things and different things. You can kind of all kind of whittle it down together in the same framework. Another way to have to simplify things is really make better experimental design, and then working with things with a lot of variables, model selection to pare down your models to only include relevant variables. Another thing you can broadly do is complexify. So maybe your models are too simple, your data is too complicated, so you need to have more sophisticated, complex models. Maybe you need to turn to the nonlinear, or maybe the multivariate, or you need to turn to something like machine learning, unsupervised learning, whatever you want to call it, etc. So again, these aren't exhausting all the examples, but just the broad picture. So simplify, complexify, and then now the third one is adapt. So maybe one thing I look at here is looking at methods and approaches from other disciplines that might be useful in, say, my own, like in biology, in epidemiology, etc. Because, you know, maybe the problem you seem to be having in your field that no one else in your field seems to know how to deal with, maybe it's a standard, there's a standard solution in another field, you know, maybe more like time series. There's something in like the forecasting or economics field that they use all the time that would be great for your tree ring time series data or whatnot. So to get better models, we might need to simplify, complexify, or adapt. And finally, new models. And again, because statistics is often about application rather than broad principles, at least when it comes to the frontiers, it will depend on the specific problems and disciplines. As we have intractable problems that old models or modern models won't solve, we'll need to develop new models. And one way to look at new models is to keep on the lookout in journals or other areas, places that publish what's being done right now. And yeah, I would say that these new models are definitely the real frontier, the farthest reaches that of which the horizon is not yet seen. Well, we've been flying around for a while, rather blind. Let's get down to a little more solid ground by providing you with some meaty, rocky resources. So I'll look at some useful journals, some websites and videos, some books, and some papers, which may or may not be from said journals. Anyway, so first, 3 journals I found really helpful for looking at new statistical methods and techniques is the R Journal, the Journal of Statistical Software, and Frontiers in Applied Mathematics and Statistics. That's all I'll say about it now because we'll dive into some examples later. Then some websites and videos. First of all, there's this thread here on big problems in statistics, which goes over some broad lists of resources like Wikipedia's list, some other papers and things like that on what other people saw as big problems in statistics that I drew a little bit from, but I didn't find them canonically valuable. Then another thing, if you really want to see an amazing video on resampling, I suggest going to number 3 here. It's a YouTube video. It's called Solve Every Statistical Problem with One Weird Trick. So it kind of has a clickbaity title, but is well worth your time. Okay, some books here. And these, at least at one point, were, and I think still are, available as PDFs. An Introduction to Statistical Learning and the Elements of Statistical Learning is part of our course. It goes a lot more into, I think, more of the machine learning, the unsupervised learning. So some of it was definitely a little bit beyond me when it comes to sort of whittling it down into a coherent place in statistical methods, but it's definitely on the modern edge of like what's being done, and so it's definitely helpful if you want to sort of strike out into that direction and go beyond my expertise to someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Anyways, then the big one that I'd love to get, I've referenced this before, the Frontiers of Statistics. Again, I don't have access to an actual copy of this yet, but you can at least get the outline of it. This is definitely a helpful resource if you want to invest in it. Okay, here's some papers. I'm going to just pull them up all now. There we go. So the first couple ones are kind of more general, so open problems in Bayesian statistics, so you can see what for Bayes what problems are coming out. I talked about this one, the cutting edge statistical methods for a life course approach, will give some modern methods in life sciences. Here's stuff on multi-level methods, so the next frontier, so cutting edge stuff there. And then these ones are more either more application studies, so SSP looking at an R package to look at sampling effort in ecological communities, so that's sort of a problem in ecology that it's trying to solve. Here's new models and methods in applied statistics for time series analysis, so dealing with time is always kind of tricky, so that's useful. And then here's trying to give you a little spacey example to go with our theme of frontiers in science. We have gamma ray blazar variability using, again, time flux distributions for dealing with gamma ray blazars. And blazar is not a antiquated piece of clothing. It's a specific, very interesting astronomical object. Anyways, and then finally, this is just guidelines about how to display and report data. So the most up-to-date guidelines of how to present your data and your methods to sort of provide transparency of what you did and justifying it. Okay, so let's jump to some examples here. We'll look at some papers from the R journal. Then we'll jump over to the Journal of Statistical Software, and then finish out with a smooth touch in the Frontiers in Applied Mathematics and Statistics. Hop to it. So looking at our journal, there is a recent paper called a guided or GUI'd tour of Bayesian regression. So I find that this is pretty cool because so a graphical user interface, that's GUI, able to let you run different Bayesian regression models through drop downs and fill in the boxes rather than having to code yourself. So this is a great resource for getting yourself started with Bayesian regression without having to sort of get lost in the computation and coding network that sort of solves part of that statistical question, statistical model, computer coding conundrum that I brought up in our Looming Problems. Then another one, this is just an editorial. We need trustworthy R packages. I took this straight from the paper. There's a need for rigorous software engineering R packages and a need for new research to bridge scientific computing with more traditional computing. So there's a need to bridge the gap between scientific and traditional computing. So again, that sort of looming problem of the actual undergirding of the computer and then actual research questions. Automated tools, introduced in graduate courses, code reviews, and welcoming developer community will democratize best practices, democratize software engineering, improve the quality, correctness, and integrity of scientific software, and by extension, the disciplines are reliant. So this tries to, it makes the case that, we need to not only be able to answer questions with statistical models and computers, we need to make sure those models are accurate, not just from a researcher standpoint, from a software engineering standpoint. Shamalama, let's get on to the Journal of Statistical Software. This first one here is the Julia connector, a functional-oriented interface for integrating Julia into R. So I've paid a little bit of attention to Julia. It's one of the newest and sort of hypiest coding languages. So this is a way to, well, if you're working in Julia and you find it really cool, but then you need to go back to R, how do you connect it? Well, this is apparently a way to do that. And they have some examples here of maybe what you can do here. I don't really understand this architecture of series, but figure 2 makes a little more sense. You're trying to essentially solve spiral trajectories. And so you have samples and then predictions. And apparently, I guess maybe it's easier to do this in Julia and then port over to R or something. But anyways, these were just examples, pretty pictures in Julia that I could pop up here. Or sorry, the paper. And then another example, data science in Status 16 frames lasso and Python integration. I wanted to showcase these two papers because a lot of these papers, like the R journal and a lot of the ones in this journal, were all about R. So I wanted to showcase, well, there are other things out there than R that are being done. So here we go, but most of them are. And so here are some examples of plots that you can make in Status 16, sort of this. Using a Python script execution, you can kind of do this map plot, lib plot, looks like concentric circles. And then a 3D plot, K means clustering, so looks like there's definitely integration with Python. So yay, we got 4 statistical languages here in 2 papers: R, Julia, Stata, and Python. Okay, let's look at our final journal examples here. We have the Dawood-Kibra estimator for beta regression model simulation application. I chose this because I kind of like beta regression. And so they just have an example here of being able to have a completion matrix from, these different variables. And then here's an editorial on machine learning and naturally complex systems. And I found this table really useful, that there's like a lot of these non-metric proximity measures in domains. So the measures here. And then what application field. So like, for example, bioinformatics has these non-metric proximities that can be sort of measured by things like the Smith-Waterson alignment, like time series analysis, max spectrometry. So there's a lot of this data that isn't like numbers, but we still want to be able to use it and analyze it and distinguish it. So it's machine learning can help us with that. And so one of the examples here is these toxic. So these are this chemical data. There's information on how the molecules are set up, and some are non-toxic and others are toxic. And so they can be actually these formulas can be encoded in a certain way and then turned into, I think, what's called like a Morgan fingerprint or a bit vector. And then you can actually do like a similarity, something. So it looks like something like a similarity matrix or something. So you can actually compare the difference between them, even though that these aren't numbers. So again, it sort of goes beyond what I strictly understand, but I sort of intuit like, okay, complex things that aren't numbers, but we want to treat them sort of like numbers. How can we do that? Well, it's a complex problem, so we need to have complex solutions. So this is definitely on the edge of like what we can do with new methods or sophisticated methods in statistics. So with that, let's conclude. We found that statistics is a wide topic used in many applications, and there is no single monolithic frontier. Rather, there are frontiers on many edges stretching out to whatever statistical problems we'll encounter. Strange new worlds, odd new formula. Now, whether reframing, modifying, or developing new models, there are a lot of exciting possibilities. So why don't you start your journey today? I hope this special topics was a start. With that, here are the first page of references. There also will be found in the description below, and a second page of references, because I am not a master at any of these. I just try to collate and understand them myself and present them to you as a bridge. In finale, I'd like to acknowledge, as always, I'm part of the DaCCoTA project, so if you found this presentation useful, please cite us under this award number. So thank you so much, and have a very boldly going day.